You cite Michael Rothberg. I found that quote like kind of interesting. Absence is the most radical form of censorship. How do you see that playing out, not just in India, but in other places? And what does that really, what type of pedagogy does that become?
So it's actually from a 1992 article written by Bourdieu and Wacquant. We were both, it's, I think, kind of from a book really written on reflexive sociology, where they talk about absence being the most radical form of censorship. And
Mhm.
it's actually very provocative, but also very true at the same time. Sometimes provocative things are true. Yes, it's quite right, because all of these, it ties back to the question that we were just talking about, absence, discursive absence, and so much historical erasure. There is this wonderful film called Sunless, directed by Chris Marker. It was part of the left bank movement and part of the French New Wave. And he talks about Japan and Guinea-Bissau in this film to really address. It's a documentary on time. It's as weird a documentary as documentaries get and as the French New Wave gets. But it's really interesting how he talks about history and memory in there. And he talks about history throwing out of its window like empty bottles what it doesn't want to remember. And I think that quite sat with me for a while and still resonates in the sense that mainstreamized history, as we know, kind of leaves out talking about affect, talking about grief and pain and lack and absence and erasure, and not in the Freudian or Lacanian sense at all, but in the sense of collective crisis that civilizations and societies and communities have faced through the edges, much like Marx writes, through the annals of blood and fire. So yeah, much in that way. It's a collective crisis, really.
And in the case of Hindutva pedagogy, or some of the neo-fascist pedagogies that are emerging, how do they construct a fascist body? Sort of in the sense that they have to be pure, like in terms of racial dynamics, disciplined. What is your take on the body politic of these fascisms?
Eugenics has always, as we know, raised science in Germany. And I think, there is this absolute necessity to, when we talk about decolonization of pedagogical sites, of pedagogical modes of education, curricula development, all of that, memory politics, it's really important to understand non-positivistic ideas of interpreting space and time. And that would mean looking beyond this hyper-scientific, neo-Kantian, German Enlightenment-oriented ways of looking at the world. There are other ways of looking at the world. Patrick Bresnihan and Naomi Milner write a wonderful book on this called All We Want Is the Earth, borrowing from James Connolly. It's really interesting that when we look back at fascisms, and it goes back to, we were talking about so much about narratives and inculcation of the same through the body and embodiment of memories, of the things that are taught in classrooms, of the way remembrance works. And it's always fractured, but it usually, I think, favors majoritarianism and eugenics and race science and even the saffron repertoire in India, talking about them being the original Aryans. The whole blood
Yeah.
soil narrative, it's very tied to the idea of homogeneity. So in a way, fascism flattens narratives. Whatever multiplicity, whatever pluriversality, multiversality is there, it attempts to flatten it and bulldoze it, homogenize it to this
Yeah.
unified code, which is where we also start talking about techno-fascism. We start talking about what mainstream media and its ties with the capital has been making it perform fascism or fascistic tendencies in certain ways.
Yeah. I want to shift to your article, which is very fascinating, the class caste politics, hierarchy in Hindutva in Indian cinema and protest theater. You describe Bollywood as an informal pedagogy. How does cinema reinforce caste and patriarchy? Because part of linking caste and gender hierarchies to national identity is, central to the Hindutva project.
Oh yeah, definitely. And was a very interesting question. Yeah, to co-authored the article with Abhilash Banerjee. And yes, there was a part where I talk about Bollywood being an informal pedagogy. Remember that, I think. It is in the sense that Bollywood in particular, and not the South Indian film industry, because again, there is a language factor here. And, you know, you must have come across this, that the Modi regime has been trying to establish Hindi as sort of the official language of India. Uh, More than half of India doesn't really endorse it as their mother tongue or a language that is spoken widely. So South India would be part of that. Part of the Northeast doesn't really speak that language. Bengal doesn't speak that language. Kashmir, of course, it's not exactly Hindi. There's Urdu and Pashto, and yeah, but again, it's not the cow-built code of Hindi that's the Modi regime is trying to impose. So long of the short, it's a very cowbelt oriented politics of cinema. And it is very casteist so far as it goes. And as we know from the works of Didi Kosambe and scholars who have taken that Marxist, neo-Marxist interpretation of class being not disjunct from caste, but actually being an intertwined category. So there is a lot of historical erasure. And as we were talking about, you know, it's the most radical form of censorship. It's absence. It's not talking about it. It's overwriting it. So there has been a lot of outcasting and overwriting in Bollywood narratives, as we know, in terms of choosing characters, in terms of casting actors, in terms of building the entire industry collective, in terms of narrativization and narratology, which are really strong tools when it comes to fascist mediation and sociolinguistic influence of any kind, that be it in the classroom setting, be in case of media, it could be in case of a cinematic venture of any kind. And now we know that they're making propagandist films, you know, Kashmir
Yeah.
Files and the like. Yeah, there's definitely Bollywood's responsible. It's been doing that for decades.
And on the other hand, protest theater like Janam's Shambuk Vad rewrites myth from below. How does this unsettle sort of the authoritarian pedagogy that Bollywood narratives try to reproduce in terms of patriarchal, Brahmanical family hierarchies and that type of thing?
So Janam, as you know, it was basically a venture. It started out with Safdar Hashmi and his friends. And of course, all the people who are involved at the minute are really, really important and have continued to carry on that, well, I wouldn't call it tradition, but rationale and method of sort of building grassroots theatre movements on the streets and from the streets, which is great. And yes, Shambhukwad, so it basically talks about the mythological character of Shambhuk, who is also one of the less talked about characters. I mean, we talk about Ram a lot more, the Lord Rama, and we don't talk as much about Ravana either, you know, speaking of mythology. So it's a bit like speaking so much about the Lord and Jesus, but not really talking as much about Lucifer, or talking so much about Eve, but not really talking about Lilith, who really refused
Yeah.
to lie beneath anybody, really. So I think that rationale kind of applies there as well, in the sense that Shambuk sort of refused to lie beneath this hierarchical class system, class caste system. And so they cut his head off, in a way, decapitated him. And so Janam sort of brings it back and suggests that he has been being decapitated. It's very interesting how time is used here. I think there's a part where they talk about he has been, so it's like almost present continuous, that he's being decapitated consistently, continuously, has happened historically.
Yeah.
But also happening now. And it reminds me of Steve McQueen's lecture in Dublin, I think last year or
Mm-hmm.
the year before. He made a film
Mm-hmm.
on the Irish famine called Hunger, the famine and the hunger strikers, basically. And
Mm.
he was delivering this lecture and he said something like, history is notes. Walter Benjamin talks about that too. He talks about the body of history and memory being inextricable from this non-positivistic Yetzite now, here and now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Janam does a good job at that.
I think what's interesting about that, it opens a space for resistance. But one thing I think that's central to what I understand about Safdar Hashmi is that he's insisting upon, the fact that class critique must also address caste oppression in a sense. And what does his legacy teach us about pedagogy or counter pedagogies today?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I suppose we have to remember is, of course, that Safdar was assassinated on the ground while performing. And it's an important thing to remember. And as you were saying, you were interested in working around the politics of death, really. And it can be worked around in a number of ways in terms of actual labor and workers who are associated with the graveyard, but also in terms of necropolitics and fascism and neoliberalism, and how it kind of promotes a politics of death. And that is material death, but also, this continuum that kind of sustains, I suppose, the undead dead in a way. It's zombie land, but metaphorical at the same time. And it prevents regeneration, which is, I think, a sustained way of dying, really. So in a way, I think Safdar's legacy sort of defies the material underpinnings of death, because with death, basically the entity, the person goes away and then is forgotten. So being forgotten, this erasure, radical erasure is, I suppose, another form of death. And we see that that hadn't happened to Safdar entirely, that hadn't happened to Janam and its legacy. So I think performance and embodiment and cinematics and theatrics. And although, I mean, there's hollow theatrics as well, and we can go back to Trump's and Elon Musk's of the world, this constant state of performance. But there are other forms of theatrics too, radical theatrics, and ways to embody what you're living and replicate and reproduce and reify it in other ways and put up microcosmic representations to the world. And in certain sense, to live it too. To live is to perform in a certain light. And I think Safdar's version of that was to learn from the streets and to reproduce and lend some of that back to the streets and to continue walking. Walking is important despite all the fashionable nihilism that wants us to stop walking.
That kind of bridges into my next question surrounding radical theater, because radical theater often turns spectators into participants. And you actually mentioned the embodied form of pedagogy that resists this sort of authoritarian disciplines. How does radical theater sort of break down the barriers between performer and audience and produce like collective embodied knowledge in your understanding?
This reminds me of a scene from a Son Image film, which was I think, late 1970s, early 1980s. Films made by Jean-Luc Godard and his partner Anne-Marie Méville. And there's this one film called Here and Elsewhere, which basically captures his journey traveling through Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine, and talking to radical artists, a group called Ziga Vertov, named after the Russian filmmaker. And he kind of comes back, and there is a scene where he talks about a lot of things, as French New Wave. They're almost essay films in a way. But there is a scene where he shows us that people are going around with placards in their hands in front of the camera. And it's basically almost like a history of cinema. It's like showing us that the placards are the ultimate frames that are being shot, but there are people holding them at the back. So I think it's a brilliant way to showcase the fact that no matter what we are doing, we are talking about human labor involved with it, even when it comes to artificial intelligence, even when it comes to data corps, e-commerce websites, when it comes to Instagram and Snapchat and Amazon and Facebook and all of that. So in a way, cinema has the ability to, as Deleuze writes as well, about time and movement image. It has this eclectic way of channeling present continuous in the moment. And there is a way to embody it. There is a way to live with it, not just as a spectator, but as part of the film itself, a part of the theatre work itself. So theatre practitioners or cinema practitioners, I think, have a role to play there in terms of allowing whoever's watching, spectator or beyond, to sort of become part of this extended repertoire, and also the other way around. In a way, the spectator also has an affinity, ability, space to offer, to become cinema or to become an extended part of the performance. But that would require desire, and desire in the Deleuzian sense from both ends, I suppose, this wanting to be involved.